The battered SUV hit the curb so hard the front tire blew out. Before the engine stopped shaking, the driver's door was ripped open, and a woman was dragged into the cold Montana night with a gun pressed against her temple. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood completely still while the trooper shouted, and the handcuffs clicked, and the small crowd gathering outside Harlow Ridge Medical Center watched in silence because nobody standing there had any idea who she actually was. Nobody, that is, except the German Shepherd that had just snapped its lead, broke in formation from a military convoy parked 40 feet away, and planted itself directly between her and the gun. Before we go any further, if this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a like, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where this all started. Emily Hartwell had learned a long time ago that the quietest rooms were usually the most dangerous ones. Not dangerous in the way civilians meant when they used that word, not the kind of dangerous that came with raised voices and slammed doors. She meant the kind of quiet that settled over a space like a held breath, the kind that came right before something ruptured. The Harlow Ridge Medical Center Emergency Department on a Tuesday night had exactly that quality. Not because it was understaffed, though it was. Not because the waiting room chairs were mostly occupied by people who'd been sitting there longer than 3 hours, though they had been. It was the specific quality of the silence between the nursing staff and the man standing near the triage desk, State Trooper Dale Rutherford, that made Emily set down her clipboard and pay attention. She had been pulling a double. 12 hours in, 4 to go, and her feet knew every inch of linoleum in that wing by the particular way they ached. She was 39 years old, 5'6", and had the kind of face that people described as calm, in a way that usually meant they'd never bothered to look closely enough. Her badge said E. Hartwell Run. Her scrubs were a faded teal. She had a mechanical pencil tucked behind her left ear and a patient chart balanced against her forearm, and she had been on her way to Bay 6 when she stopped. Rutherford was a big man. Not tall, maybe an inch shorter than Emily, actually, but built wide across the chest and shoulders, in the specific way of someone who spent a lot of time making sure other people noticed it. He was leaning over the triage counter, not in an aggressive way technically, but in a way that made the ward clerk, a 24-year-old named Priya, press herself slightly back against the supply cabinet. "I need him moved to a private room," Rutherford was saying. "He's a subject in an active investigation, and I'm not having him talked to by your staff until I say so." Priya glanced at the tablet in her hands. "Sir, Bay 4 is standard triage protocol. If Dr. Messner wants to, I don't care what Messner wants. I'm telling you what the law requires." Emily walked to the counter. She didn't announce herself. She just moved into the space beside Priya, set her chart down, and looked at Rutherford with the particular quality of attention she'd developed somewhere between her second tour and her third, the kind that didn't escalate and didn't retreat. "Can I help with something?" Rutherford looked at her the way men like him often looked at nurses, a brief scan that clocked her badge, dismissed her, and moved on. "This is a police matter. I understand that. What's the patient status?" "I can let Dr. Messner know. I don't need you to let Messner know anything. I need you to stay in your lane." He turned back to Priya. "Now, private room, or I start making calls." Emily looked at Priya, who gave the microscopic shoulder movement that meant, "Please don't make this worse." She picked her chart back up and walked toward Bay 4. The man inside was named Thomas Briggs, according to the intake sheet. 47. He'd been brought in by ambulance after a vehicle stop went sideways on Route 9, blunt force trauma to the left temporal region, possible concussion, lacerations on both forearms. He was conscious, oriented to person and place if not entirely to time, and he smelled like someone who'd had a long day before the worst part of it started. He also had the particular way of holding his left arm slightly elevated, wrist turned inward, that Emily had seen exactly twice before in her life, and both times it had meant a concealed fracture of the radial head that 3 other people had already missed. She set her chart on the hook, pulled on fresh gloves, and began her assessment. She was halfway through when Rutherford appeared in the doorway. "I told the desk he wasn't to be assessed until—" "He's my patient," Emily said, without looking up from Briggs's wrist. "Dr. Messner assigned this bay to me. I don't care who." "Sir," she looked up then, steady. Not confrontational, just exact. "I understand you have jurisdiction over whatever happened outside. Inside this department, the clinical team has authority over patient care. If you want to speak with our charge nurse or with Dr. Messner about your concerns, I'll let them know you're here." Rutherford's jaw tightened. He looked at Briggs, then back at Emily, and something moved through his expression that she recognized, not anger exactly. Calculation. Nurse, he glanced at her badge. Hartwell. You're interfering with a police matter. I'm completing a patient assessment. Those are different things. I'm going to need your supervisor's name. Keisha Odom. Charge nurse. She's at the main station. Emily turned back to Briggs. Sir, can you tell me if this hurts when I do this? Briggs hissed through his teeth. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to have radiology come down. She heard Rutherford leave. She finished the assessment, flagged the probable radial fracture, documented it, and moved to the next bay. 17 minutes later, Keisha appeared at her elbow with a look on her face that Emily had also learned to read. Rutherford filed a complaint, Keisha said quietly. Says you interfered with his custody of a prisoner. Briggs isn't in custody. He's a patient. I know that. Keisha lowered her voice further. He's also talking to Morrison. Dr. Gary Morrison was the hospital's medical director, a man Emily had 4 years of experience with, and none of it had convinced her he was primarily interested in medicine. He was primarily interested in not having difficult conversations with law enforcement. Emily, I need you to just let this one go. He has a concealed radial fracture that 2 intake nurses missed. He needed the assessment. I know you're right. But Morrison is going to. Then I'll talk to Morrison. She did talk to Morrison. It went about as well as the prior conversation, except that Morrison had a larger office and a more expensive chair to sit in, while he explained to Emily that Harlow Ridge had a working relationship with the county sheriff's department and the state police that went back 15 years, and that relationship was worth preserving. I'm not asking you to compromise patient care, he said, in the tone of someone who was in fact asking exactly that. I'm asking you to be more sensitive to the institutional context. Emily sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at the diplomas on the wall behind him and said, Briggs had a fracture. We caught it. He's going to imaging now. That's fine. That's good. What I'm saying is the manner in which... Was I rude to the trooper? Morrison paused. He felt disrespected. I told him my charge nurse's name and explained hospital protocol. Emily. Morrison pressed his fingers together. I've had 3 conversations today about your attitude in this department. The staff find you distant. The residents say you correct them without... I correct them when they're about to hurt someone. There are better ways to... I'll work on my delivery, Emily said. Is there anything else? There was. There was a great deal else, as it turned out, and most of it was Rutherford, who had apparently spent the intervening 20 minutes on his phone rather than his case file. By the time Emily walked back out to the department floor, the charge nurse was reading something off a tablet with a tight expression, and Rutherford was standing near the exit with his arms crossed, and he was looking directly at Emily. Hartwell, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Half the department went quiet anyway. I've spoken with the department and the hospital administration. You've been identified as creating an obstruction to an active investigation. You're being asked to leave the premises. The room did something strange. It seemed to contract slightly, the way rooms did when something said out loud crossed a line that everyone present knew existed, but nobody had expected to be crossed quite so openly. Emily looked at Keisha, who had gone completely still. She looked at Rutherford. I'm in the middle of a shift. That's a matter between you and hospital administration. Right now, I need you to collect your personal belongings and exit the building. On what authority? On the authority of... He took a step toward her. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Priya was staring at the floor. 2 of the residents had discovered reasons to be very interested in their charts. Dr. Messner, who was technically the senior physician on the floor and could have said something, should have said something, had walked into a supply room approximately 40 seconds before this moment, which Emily suspected was not a coincidence. She thought about all the things she could say. There were several, and some of them were true, and at least one would have been genuinely satisfying. She did not say any of them. She took her mechanical pencil from behind her ear, set it on the triage counter, picked up her bag from beneath the desk where she kept it during shifts, and walked out. The Montana night hit her immediately cold clear, with that particular dry edge that came off the high country after sundown in April. Her car was in the staff lot, a 2016 Subaru Outback, with a cracked rear bumper and approximately 93,000 miles on it, and she sat in it for a moment, with her hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. She wasn't shaking. She noted this the same way she noted a patient's vital signs, as a data point, not a verdict. What she was, she decided after a moment, was tired. Not the tired that came from the double shift, though that was also present. The other kind. The one that had been accumulating for 4 years, ever since she'd landed in Bozeman with a duffel bag and a nursing license, and a very specific intention to be someone different from who she'd been. She started the car. She had an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital, on the second floor of a building that smelled like other people's cooking after 6 p.m. She had a cat named Sable who had been acquired by accident when a patient left him in the waiting room 3 years ago. She had a shelf of medical texts and one photograph face down that she kept on the top shelf of her closet and had not looked at in 2 years. She drove. She was 6 blocks from the hospital when the radio scanner she kept clipped to her visor, a habit she'd never quite broken, crackled to life. At first, it was standard traffic. An accident report on the South Interchange. A domestic disturbance call in the Pines district. Then a different frequency, a different quality of voice, clipped, controlled, carrying the specific cadence of someone trained to stay level while everything around them was not. Multiple casualties, military personnel, requesting immediate trauma support at Harlow Ridge. Repeat, multiple casualties. She was already turning the car around before the sentence finished. She didn't think about Rutherford. She didn't think about Morrison, or Keisha, or the mechanical pencil she'd left on the counter. She thought about the voice on the scanner, multiple casualties, military personnel, and she thought about the specific register of injuries that phrase implied, and she thought about the fact that Harlow Ridge's trauma team was moderately equipped for hunting accidents and cardiac events, and the particular brand of disaster that came from living an hour from the nearest level eye center. What it was not equipped for, what almost no civilian trauma center was equipped for, was the specific category of wound that certain military personnel sustained in certain situations. She knew what those looked like. She knew how fast they moved. She knew exactly how many ways a well-meaning civilian physician could make them worse. She parked on the access road rather than the staff lot, because the staff lot was already blocked 2 black SUVs, a tactical vehicle, and a convoy truck with government plates that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. She came in through the side entrance, the one that required a badge she technically wasn't supposed to be using anymore, but the lock reader didn't know that yet. The department was a different place than the one she'd left. The particular organized calm of a normal shift had been replaced by a different quality, still organized, but faster, tighter, with the specific vibration of people working at the edge of their capacity. 2 gurneys were coming through the main trauma entrance. A third was already in Bay 2. She could see blood, real blood, not the small wound variety, and she could see the kind of injuries that didn't come from car accidents or construction sites. Keisha was at the central station, phone at her ear, face doing the thing it did when there were too many variables. She saw Emily, and something complicated moved through her expression. "You can't be here." "I know." Emily was already moving toward Bay 2. "What do you have, Emily? GSW, blast injury, or both?" A pause. Keisha made a decision. Bay 2 has a penetrating chest wound, tension pneumo developing. Bay 1 is blast, they think fragmentation, left leg, possible vascular involvement. Bay 3 just came in. They're still assessing. Emily dropped her bag at the wall and pulled gloves from the dispenser. "Who's primary on Bay 2? Messner, but she was already in Bay 2. The patient was a man in his early 30s, in the remains of tactical gear that someone had partially cut away. His breathing had the quality she recognized instantly: labored, asymmetric, with the subtle tracheal deviation that meant she had maybe 3 minutes before the tension pneumothorax became a cardiac event. Messner was at the head of the bed, ordering imaging. A second-year resident was trying to get IV access. "He needs a needle decompression," Emily said. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line now." Messner looked up. "Hartwell, you're not. His trachea is deviating. You don't have time for imaging." She moved to the supply cart, found the angiocath, positioned herself. "I need you to tell me yes or no in the next 10 seconds, because after that it won't matter." Messner stared at her for exactly 4 of those seconds. "Then, do it." She did it. The rush of air was immediate, the release of pressure audible, and the patient's breathing changed, still labored, still compromised, but no longer the specific quality that preceded arrest. The resident at the IV line got access 30 seconds later. "He's going to need a chest tube," Emily said, stepping back. "His breath sounds on the left are still. I see it." Messner was moving now, recalibrated. "Thank you." She was back in the main corridor before she could register anything about that exchange. Bay 1 was a controlled chaos: 2 nurses, a physician she didn't recognize, and a medic in partial uniform who was trying to give a handoff to someone who clearly wasn't following the terminology. She moved toward them. The physician, Dr. Sandoval, by his badge, someone she'd seen twice at staff meetings, was focused on the leg wound, which was significant and required attention, but he was missing something. She could see it in the blood pressure reading on the monitor, in the specific pallor of the patient's face, in the way his abdomen looked slightly distended. "There's a secondary injury," she said to Sandoval. "Abdominal. Probably splenic. Look at the BP trend and the periumbilical bruising." Sandoval glanced at her. "Who are you? I work here." "Your nurse. Look at the abdomen." He looked. She watched the recognition move across his face. "Get surgery down here," he said to the nearest nurse. Then to Emily, "You're right. He needs a fast exam before surgery gets here."
I know.
"Get the ultrasound." She was getting the ultrasound when Rutherford walked into the department. She saw him from across the room, and he saw her, and his expression did something she'd seen before in people who believed they'd resolved a situation only to find it unresolved. He was across the floor in 15 seconds. Hartwell, low, controlled. "I told you to leave the building. I'm in the middle of patient care. You don't work here tonight. I had you removed, sir." She kept her voice at the volume of clinical conversation. "There are 3 critically injured patients in this department right now. I have skills that are relevant to their treatment. You can have me removed again after they're stable. I can have you removed right now, then do it." She met his eyes. "But do it in front of the cameras, and do it in front of whatever military personnel just arrived, and do it in front of the patients you'd be pulling care from, and then do it in writing." Something moved through Rutherford's face. Not doubt she didn't think he was capable of it. Exactly, but recalculation. He looked at the trauma bays. He looked at the military vehicles visible through the glass of the main entrance. He looked at Emily. "This isn't over," he said. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the ultrasound. She had the probe on the patient's abdomen when the main doors opened again, and this time it was different. The 2 people who came through first were in tactical gear and were clearly security, but the person behind them was an officer Navy, by the insignia, a commander's rank, and the kind of bearing that came not from performance but from long practice. Behind him, on a tactical lead, was a German shepherd, large and dark-coated, moving with the controlled alertness of a working animal at full attention. Emily did not look up from the ultrasound. She could hear the officer speaking to someone near the entrance. She could hear Rutherford's voice, shifted into a register she recognized as the one he used when he wanted to establish authority with someone he wasn't quite sure he outranked. She found what she was looking for on the screen. Splenic laceration. Grade 2 at minimum. Possible grade 3. Get surgery down here now if they're not already on their way. Sandoval was behind her. Already paged. 2 minutes. She stepped back, pulled off the soiled glove, reached for a fresh one. It was in that exact moment, gloves half on, standing at the edge of Bay 1, that the German shepherd went still. The dog had been moving through the department in the controlled sweep pattern of a trained working animal, but now it stopped. Its head came up, its ears shifted, and then, in the specific way of a working dog that has just processed something that overrides its current task, it turned its head directly toward Emily and made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, but a low, distinct vocalization, and pulled once sharply against its handler's lead. The handler, a young Navy petty officer, tried to correct. The dog did not correct. It pulled again, harder toward Emily, and made the sound again. And in the controlled chaos of the trauma department, nobody had time to notice except the officer, who turned and looked across the room and went completely still. Emily pulled the second glove on. She looked down at the patient. She felt the officer's gaze before she saw it, a particular quality of recognition she had not felt directed at her in 4 years, and had, until this moment, believed she might never feel again. She looked up. He was standing 20 feet away. 42 or 43, silver at his temples, a scar along his jaw that she knew the origin of, because she had once put 11 stitches into it with a suture kit in the back of a moving vehicle in a place that did not officially exist. His expression was doing something complicated and controlled, the way expressions did on faces that had been trained not to show what was happening behind them. He said one word. Not her name, not Nurse Hartwell. The word he said was something else entirely, 2 syllables, a designation she had spent 4 years trying to forget, and he said it quietly enough that only she and the petty officer with the dog could hear it. The German shepherd was still pulling toward her, tail moving now, making the specific sound of a working animal that has found something it was looking for. Emily stood at the edge of Bay 1 with a fresh pair of gloves and an ultrasound probe, and the particular stillness of someone who had just watched 4 years of very careful construction begin to crack. Rutherford was already moving toward the officer. She could see it in her peripheral vision, Rutherford with his chest out, with his authority assembled, moving to establish himself, before someone else could establish themselves first. She looked back down at her patient. His blood pressure was 84/60, and surgery was still 90 seconds away, and there was a grade 3 splenic laceration on the ultrasound screen. And those were the facts that mattered right now. Those were the only facts that mattered. She pressed the probe back to the abdomen and began the secondary scan. Behind her, she heard Rutherford say, "Commander, I'm going to need to ask you to." And she heard the commander's voice, level and absolute, cut across him like a door closing. "Petty Officer Dawes, secure the dog. And someone get me, whoever is running this trauma bay." There was a brief silence, and then Dr. Messner's voice, from across the room. That would be her. Emily did not turn around. She watched the ultrasound screen, and she breathed, and she waited for surgery to arrive. And she did not let herself think about the 2 syllables the commander had said, or the dog that had broken formation to find her, or the fact that the careful, quiet life she had built here, in this cold Montana town, in this underfunded emergency department, had just been located by something she had spent 4 years running from. The surgery team came through the doors, and somewhere behind her, Dale Rutherford said, in a voice that was no longer quite as certain as it had been, "What do you mean, her? What do you mean, her?" Nobody answered Rutherford immediately. That was the thing about rooms operating at full capacity. There was no bandwidth left for explaining things to people who weren't part of the solution. The surgery team came through the doors at a controlled run, 2 attendings and a scrub tech with a crash cart behind them, and the bay reorganized itself instantly around their arrival the way trauma bays did, everything shifting to accommodate the new hierarchy of urgency. Emily stepped back. She gave the lead surgeon doctor, Patricia Voss, whom she'd worked alongside 3 times and respected significantly, a clean 30-second handoff. Splenic laceration. Grade 3 on fast. Blood pressure trending down. No allergies documented. 2 large borees in place. Blood type pending. Voss didn't ask who Emily was or why she was there. She just listened, nodded twice, and took over the bay with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 22 years. Emily stripped her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and turned around. Commander Neil Prakash was still standing in the middle of the department. He had not moved toward her. He was watching her with an expression she remembered, careful, measured, the face he made when he was assembling information before he said anything out loud. The German shepherd, Dawes now holding the lead with 2 hands, had settled into a sitting position, but kept its dark eyes fixed on Emily, with an attention that was almost embarrassing. Rutherford was at Prakash's elbow, still talking. She could see the shape of the conversation from here. Rutherford explaining something, Prakash not responding in the ways Rutherford expected, which was making Rutherford talk faster and louder, in the way that men did when authority wasn't landing the way it was supposed to. Keisha appeared beside Emily. "Surgery's also on the way for Bay 2's chest tube," Keisha said, keeping her voice low. "Bay 3 patient is conscious and refusing treatment, which is its own problem." She paused. "You should go, Rutherford. He's already called Morrison twice in the last 10 minutes. Morrison is Emily. Morrison is looking for a reason. You giving Rutherford this ammunition is not—" "I didn't give him anything. I did my job, I know that." Keisha's voice had something in it that wasn't quite frustration, something more like grief, the kind that came from watching a situation head toward a wall and knowing you didn't have the wheel. "But Rutherford's filing an official interference complaint tonight, and Morrison is going to support it. And if you're still here when that paperwork goes in, then I'm still here." Keisha closed her eyes briefly. "You have no backup, Emily. That's not new." From across the room, Prakash looked away from Rutherford and looked directly at Emily. She held the look for a moment, then moved toward Bay 3, because there was a patient in Bay 3 who was refusing treatment, and that was a clinical problem that needed handling regardless of everything else that was happening. Bay 3 was a younger man, mid-20s, Emily guessed, with the lean build and the particular way of holding himself that she'd learned to read a long time ago. His name on the intake sheet was listed as Reyes J. He had a laceration above his left eyebrow that needed suturing, and a probable concussion, and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "I don't need the stitches," he said, before Emily could speak. "You need 6 of them minimum. I've had worse." "I know." She pulled a stool to the side of the bed and sat down, which she almost never did, because sitting put you at eye level instead of above it, and eye level was a different kind of conversation. "But that laceration is close to your orbital margin. If it closes wrong, you're going to have visibility problems." He looked at her. Something shifted. "You know what I do. I know what the injuries look like. I don't know anything else." She picked up the suture kit. "This is going to take about 8 minutes. You can tell me to stop at any point. He was quiet for a moment, then Reyes, Jason, Emily. I know who you are. He said it with a flatness that meant it wasn't a compliment or an accusation, just a statement. Prakash hasn't stopped talking about you since we came in. Emily opened the suture kit and did not respond to that. He said you were gone, Reyes continued. Said you just left. Discharge processed, apartment cleared, nobody knew where you went. People go where they need to go. She uncapped the lidocaine. Small stick. He flinched, minimally. She began the infiltration, letting the anesthetic set before she touched the laceration. He had the particular tension of someone trained to keep still under discomfort, and he kept still very well. He was worried, Reyes said after a moment. For the record, he shouldn't have been. Well, a beat. He was anyway. She placed the first suture. He didn't move. Outside the bay curtain, she could hear the department in its elevated state, the hum of equipment, the clipped exchanges, the specific quality of a space working above its normal bandwidth. She could also hear, closer, the particular cadence of a conversation that was going wrong in a specific direction. Rutherford's voice rising. Don't have authority to override my... Prakash's voice level. I'm not trying to override anything, Trooper. I'm asking a question. She was removed from this building under what statute? A pause. She was identified... Under what statute? Prakash said again, same tone, same volume, like someone turning the same key in the same lock with absolute patience. Emily placed the second suture. He's going to eat him alive, Reyes said quietly. Don't move your face. Sorry. He went still again. Then Prakash, Rutherford doesn't know what he walked into. Rutherford knows exactly what he's doing, Emily said. That's the problem. She placed the third suture. Outside, the voices had dropped, which was sometimes better and sometimes significantly worse. She focused on the laceration, on the alignment of tissue, on making the closure clean enough that Reyes would have the full orbital visibility he needed for whatever he did in the dark with those hands and that particular way of moving. There were 4 of us from the convoy who came in, Reyes said. Marcus and Okonkwo are in surgery, you know about that. Torelli's in Bay 2, the chest. He paused. He's the reason I'm talking to you. Emily glanced up briefly. Torelli. He's been in and out for about 6 months. Medically. Not from this was tonight. But before this, he had a surgery that didn't go right, and he's got. Reyes paused, choosing words. He's got a complication. Something with the chest wall. I don't know the technical term. But when I saw how he came in, I didn't think anyone here was going to know what they were looking at. They caught it, Emily said. Needle decompression is textbook. I heard. He paused. I heard it was you. She placed the 4th suture. The thing with Torelli, Reyes said, is that the previous surgery left scarring along the left pleural margin. Standard decompression might not be enough. There's a modified approach. I know the modified approach. Reyes went quiet. Emily could feel him reassembling something in his head, some version of who this woman in the faded teal scrubs was and whether it matched what he'd been told. She placed the 5th suture. Who's his outside physician from the previous surgery? Dr. Anand Kapoor, Naval Medical Center, San Diego. Call him tonight. Get Torelli's full surgical history faxed here before morning. If the chest tube closes and reaccumulates, the team needs to know about the pleural scarring before they make the next decision. Reyes pulled his phone out with the hand she wasn't working near. Okay. And she stopped, placed the 6th suture, tied it off, leaned back and looked at the closure, which was clean. Tell them standard chest film positioning may give a false read on that side. They need the angled view. He was already typing. She began the dressing. 5 minutes later, she stepped out of Bay 3 and nearly walked directly into Neil Prakash. He was right there a foot away, in the corridor between bays, and she stopped and he stopped, and the department moved around them like water around 2 stones. He looked exactly like she remembered, and also different in the ways that 4 years made things different, a little more gray. A few new lines around his eyes, the scar on his jaw that she'd put there now fully healed to a clean white seam. He was watching her with the careful expression she remembered, but underneath it was something she didn't remember or hadn't let herself look at the last time. Hartwell, he said. Then quieter, Emily. Commander. A beat. You left without, I'm not, he stopped. Started again. I'm not here to this isn't about before. I need to talk to you about the patients. Then talk to Dr. Messner, or Dr. Sandoval, or Dr. Voss, who is a significantly better surgeon than I am and is currently in the OR with your people. Voss doesn't know Torelli's history. Reyes is calling Kapoor right now. Prakash blinked. One of the few times she'd ever seen him surprised. You already? Yes. He looked at her for a moment. Okonkwo has a fragmentation pattern that's unusual. Left leg, but the distribution suggests secondary device, Emily said. Not primary blast. The fragments travel differently. The surgeon who has him, tell them to check the popliteal. Secondary fragmentation from that angle likes the posterior compartment, and the popliteal vessel is vulnerable in a way that doesn't always show on the initial scan. He stared at her, not with surprise this time, with something that was less readable and more uncomfortable. I'll tell them, he said. Good, she moved to step around him. Emily. He didn't reach out to stop her, just said her name, and the way he said it made her stop anyway. What happened to you? After I became a nurse, she said. In Montana. That's what happened. She walked back to the central station. Keisha was there, and the expression on Keisha's face had progressed from worried to something that was tilting toward alarmed. Morrison is on his way in, Keisha said. Rutherford called him personally. Of course he did. Emily, if Morrison suspends you with Rutherford's complaint on record, can you get me the chart for Torelli? Bay 2 patient? That's not Keisha. Chart. Keisha pulled it. Emily scanned the current notes, the imaging orders, the medication record. Messner had documented the needle decompression, and she looked twice credited himself as the primary decision-maker, which was inaccurate, but fine. What mattered was whether Torelli's chest tube was in the right position, given the scarring Reyes had described. What's his current SAT? Emily asked the nurse nearest Bay 2. 91 and climbing. He's more comfortable. Have them check tube position with a PA and lateral before they're happy with 91. Tell Messner I said the left pleural has prior scarring. The tube may be abutting it. The nurse, a young man named Doyle, whom Emily had trained 6 months ago, and who still wrote her name on his shift notes when she'd taught him something, nodded and went. Morrison arrived 11 minutes later. He came in through the administrative entrance rather than the main floor, which told her he wasn't there for the patients. He was in a suit jacket over a dress shirt, which told her he'd been at home when Rutherford called. He was with Rutherford, which told her everything else. They stopped at the edge of the department. Morrison scanned the floor, found Emily at the central station, and walked toward her with Rutherford at his left shoulder like punctuation. Emily. Morrison's voice had the particular quality of performed regret. I told you to go home. I came back. That's the problem. He glanced around the active trauma bays, the surgery team cycling in and out, the military personnel still present near the entrance. I understand there was an emergency. 3 critically injured patients. And I appreciate that I felt that they needed care. That's the correct feeling to have. Morrison's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being interrupted, and Emily had been interrupting him for 4 years. Regardless of the circumstances, you were removed from this facility tonight under a formal request from a law enforcement officer. Coming back constitutes a nurse responding to a mass casualty event, Emily said. If you'd like to have a conversation about whether that was appropriate, I'd suggest doing it somewhere with fewer witnesses. This is the appropriate, because right now, she continued. Same volume. You're telling a nurse she shouldn't have come back to help with 3 critically injured military personnel. And those military personnel are still here, and so are their command officers. She let that land for exactly 1 second. I'd think about how that conversation looks from the outside, Doctor. Morrison. Rutherford took a step forward. She threatened me earlier tonight. On the floor in front of witnesses. I told you to do things in writing, Emily said. That's not a threat. You told me to remove you in front of cameras. Because that's how documentation works, yes. Morrison put a hand up, regardless of the specifics. Commander Prakash. Emily said it at normal conversational volume, and it carried anyway, because she'd spent years learning how to make her voice do exactly what she needed it to do in exactly the environment she was standing in. Prakash was 20 feet away, speaking with one of the surgery attendings. He looked over. I think Dr. Morrison has some questions about the clinical decisions made tonight. You might want to be part of that conversation. Rutherford turned. He looked at Prakash. Something moved through his expression, the first genuine uncertainty she'd seen from him all night. Prakash excused himself from the attending and walked over. He looked at Morrison. He looked at Rutherford. He looked at Emily with an expression that was carefully neutral in the specific way of someone who is not neutral at all, but has chosen this particular moment to be strategic about it. Is there a problem? He said. Morrison recovered first. Commander, I want to assure you that Harlow Ridge is committed to providing the best possible. Your nurse, Prakash said, the word you're doing something complicated, caught a tension pneumothorax before it arrested one of my men. She identified a splenic laceration that 2 physicians had missed. She gave my medic specific information about a prior surgical complication that could have changed the entire course of Torelli's treatment tonight. He paused. Is that the problem? Morrison opened his mouth, because if it is, Prakash said, I'd very much like to understand that. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Morrison looked at Rutherford. Rutherford's jaw was doing something it didn't usually do, working without output, which was new. There are process concerns, Morrison said finally, in a voice that had lost most of its authority. About what? About the manner in which... I'd like them in writing, Prakash said. By 8 a.m., with specifics. He looked at Rutherford. That applies to you as well, Trooper. Rutherford straightened. With respect, Commander, this is a civilian matter, and you don't have... No, Prakash agreed pleasantly. I don't. But I have 3 men in surgery and a 4th in that bay, and I intend to be here until I know they're stable. So I'll be a witness to whatever happens in this department tonight. He let that sit, just so everyone knows. Morrison left 20 minutes later, with Rutherford behind him. Neither of them said anything else to Emily directly. She stood at the central station and watched them go. Keisha was beside her. He didn't have to do that. No, Keisha was quiet for a moment. Then Bay 2's tube position is better. Messner repositioned it based on your note. Sats up to 96. Good. Surgery's estimating another hour on Okonkwo. Emily nodded. She looked at the board. 3 critical patients, 2 in surgery, 1 improving. The department was still elevated, but had found a rhythm, the particular rhythm of a trauma floor, that had been pushed past its normal capacity and was managing it. She'd worked in worse conditions. She'd worked in conditions that made this look like a training exercise. That was the thought she pushed away. You should eat something, Keisha said. There's leftover cafeteria food in the break room, which is terrible, but it exists. In a minute, she pulled Torelli's chart again, checked the SAT, the blood pressure trend, the tube drainage output. Everything was moving in the right direction. She added a note, her own name this time, documented clearly, timestamped recommending a repeat film in 4 hours with specific attention to the left pleural margin. She was closing the chart when Doyle appeared at her elbow. He was doing the thing he did when he had news. He wasn't sure how to deliver, which involved standing slightly too close and not immediately speaking. Doyle. Rutherford came back, he said. Not through the front. The administrative entrance. He's with someone I don't recognize, civilian clothes, but he had a law enforcement badge. They went into Morrison's office. Emily set the chart down. And there's something else. Doyle looked at the floor, then back up. I was at the charge desk when Rutherford was talking to Morrison earlier before. When he came in, I wasn't supposed to be listening. But you were, he said. Doyle hesitated. He said he needed this dealt with tonight, that if the story changed, it was going to affect something. A contract, I think. He kept saying the contract. Morrison was asking what kind, and Rutherford kept saying it didn't matter. That what mattered was the documentation being consistent. Emily was quiet for a moment. The documentation of what? Of tonight. Of you being removed. Of why you were removed. Doyle swallowed. He said the arrest had to be on record. That there had to be an arrest. She looked at him. He said that. Yeah. She thought about Thomas Briggs in Bay 4, the original patient, the one she'd assessed when this started, the one Rutherford had tried to isolate. She thought about the radial fracture she'd flagged. She thought about the phrase Rutherford had used earlier, your biggest success story. She thought about the vehicle alert system Rutherford had referenced when he'd initially come into the department, the automated alert that had supposedly flagged Briggs's car on Route 9. She'd caught that detail and filed it away, the way she filed away things that didn't quite fit. Where's Briggs? She asked. Bay 4. Still waiting on radiology. The imaging techs have been slammed with the trauma cases. Emily looked at the board, made a decision. Get me the imaging order timestamp for Briggs, she said, and pull the triage intake notes from when he came in. Why? Because Rutherford spent a lot of time tonight telling me to stay in my lane, Emily said. And I want to know why his patient matters more than 3 soldiers in surgery. Doyle went. Emily moved toward Bay 4, and as she did, she passed the main entrance where 2 of Prakash's security personnel were still stationed, and through the glass she could see the military vehicles still parked on the access road, and beyond them the cold Montana dark. She pushed the curtain back on Bay 4. Briggs was exactly where she'd left him, sitting up on the gurney, arm immobilized, expression carrying the resigned patience of a man accustomed to waiting. He looked up when she came in. You again, he said. Not unfriendly. Still waiting on imaging? Still waiting on everything. He shifted, winced slightly. Didn't they send you home? Twice. She pulled the stool over. Sat, Mr. Briggs, I want to ask you something, and you can tell me it's none of my business. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, the stop tonight on Route 9. The vehicle alert. What were you doing before it happened? Something shifted in Briggs's face, not alarm. Exactly, but attention. The particular attention of someone recalibrating who they're talking to. I was driving home from Glenview, he said slowly. I work there. I'm a field tech for a road monitoring system. Emily was quiet. The ironic thing, Briggs said carefully, is that the vehicle alert that flagged my car? It's the same system I install. It's called TruePoint. The county just rolled it out. He paused. I know because I installed 6 of the units on Route 9 last month. You installed them. Me and my crew. He looked at his immobilized arm. And they flagged my car. Which I mean, I know how they work. I know what they're supposed to catch. My car shouldn't have flagged. Emily let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Briggs, she said, when Rutherford stopped you, did he seem like he was expecting the alert? Or did it look like he was responding to something real-time? The question hung in the air between them. Briggs looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting for 4 hours in a hospital bay with a broken arm and an unanswered question, and had just realized that maybe someone was finally asking the right thing. He pulled me over before the alert went off, Briggs said. I clocked it because I know the system. The alert tone came from his vehicle unit, I heard it. But the light bar was already on, he said it quietly. Not with drama, not with the energy of someone making an accusation, with the flat precision of a man describing exactly what he'd observed. Emily stood. Don't go anywhere. I have a broken arm and no car, Briggs said. I was planning to stay. She stepped back out through the curtain. The department around her was still in its elevated state monitors. Voices, the particular ambient noise of a building working past capacity. She could see Doyle at the charge desk, pulling something from the system. She could see, through the glass of Morrison's office, the silhouettes of 2 people in conversation. She could see Prakash near the entrance, talking to someone on a phone, and she could see the German shepherd sitting at his feet, and she could see even from here the moment Prakash looked up and found her in the corridor, and held the look, and said something into the phone and lowered it. He walked toward her. Okonkwo's out of surgery, he said. They got the fragments. He's going to keep the leg. Good. He stopped, looked at her face. What happened? Nothing yet, she said. And then, because it was true and because she needed someone else to know it, Rutherford's in Morrison's office. And I think the reason he needed me out of this building tonight has nothing to do with protocol. Prakash looked at her for a long moment. Tell me, he said. And from the direction of Morrison's office, the door opened, and Dale Rutherford walked out. And when he saw Emily standing in the corridor with Neil Prakash, his expression did something she had not seen from him all night, something she recognized from a long time ago, from other corridors and other confrontations, the look of a man who has just realized the situation has moved without him. He reached for his radio. And Emily watched him do it, and she thought about all the ways this could go from here. Rutherford was good at this, she'd give him that. He had the instinct of someone who'd spent a career controlling narratives before they could form into something harder to manage. The radio call took 11 seconds. Short, coded, the specific vocabulary of someone who didn't want the full picture on a recorded channel. When he lowered it, he looked at Emily with an expression that had reorganized itself into something calmer and more dangerous than the one she'd seen a moment ago. Hartwell, he said, I need you to come with me. For what purpose? There are questions about the events tonight that need to be addressed in a formal setting. Prakash hadn't moved from beside her, he said very quietly. She's not going anywhere without counsel present. Rutherford's eyes moved to him. With respect, Commander, this is a civilian matter, yes, you've said. Prakash's voice was the same temperature it had been all night, not warm, not cold, simply precise. And she's a civilian, so she has the right to counsel before any formal questioning. That's also a civilian matter. Something moved through Rutherford's expression, the briefest recalculation. He looked back at Emily. This doesn't have to be adversarial. You pulled me out of an active trauma bay with a gun on the floor behind you, Emily said. That's a strange definition of non-adversarial. I had a legal basis for what's in Morrison's office, she said. The room shifted. Not physically, the department kept moving around them. The monitors, the nurses cycling between bays, Doyle at the charge desk, pretending to look at a chart. But the space between the 3 of them contracted. Rutherford didn't answer immediately, and the pause was the answer. Who's the second person? Emily asked. Civilian clothes, law enforcement badge. Who is he? That's not something I'm prepared to. Because if he's here in an official capacity, his presence should be logged. And if he's not here in an official capacity, he shouldn't be in a hospital administrator's office discussing an active case. She let that sit for 1 second. Either way, it's worth asking about. Rutherford looked at her for a long moment. She'd seen that look before, not on him, but on men like him. The look of someone doing fast math on a situation and not liking the sums. This conversation is over, he said. He put the radio back on his belt. Don't leave the building, Hartwell. We're not done. He walked back toward Morrison's office. The door closed behind him. Prakash was quiet for a moment. Then, how much of that did you actually know, and how much were you guessing? About 60-40, Emily said. Which way? Guessing was the 60. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, and it made the scar along his jaw move in a way she recognized. Tell me about the system, the true point. She told him what Briggs had said. All of it, the installation timeline, the Route 9 units, the sequence of the light bar, and the alert tone. Prakash listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she remembered about him. He was a good listener in the specific way of someone who understood that the information in what people said was almost always less useful than the information in how they said it. When she finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. That's not just procedural misconduct. No. If the alert was manufactured, if Rutherford was activating it retroactively or triggering false positives, then every arrest he's made using TruePoint is potentially compromised, Emily said. And if the county signed a contract based on his success rate, someone's protecting the contract by protecting his record. That's what I think. Prakash looked toward Morrison's office. The person in there with Morrison. I need to know who he is. I can make a call, Prakash said. He didn't say what kind of call or to whom, and Emily didn't ask. She had enough experience with the particular architecture of what Prakash could and couldn't do to know that asking would produce an answer that was technically accurate and practically useless. Doyle, she said, loudly enough to carry to the charge desk. Doyle looked up. He had the intake notes she'd asked for. She could see the printout in his hand. He brought it over with the specific energy of someone who was both nervous and committed, which was the best combination for a situation like this. Briggs's triage intake, Doyle said, handing it over. Time-stamped at 22:14. And here he pulled a second sheet, the TruePoint alert log. Rutherford submitted it as supporting documentation for the arrest. It's in the incident file. Emily looked at the alert log, then at the triage timestamp, then back at the alert log. The alert is timestamped 22:19, she said.
Yeah.
Briggs was brought in by ambulance at 22:14. He'd already been stopped, injured, and transported before this alert logged. Yeah, Doyle said again. I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. You're not reading it wrong. She looked at the two sheets side by side. 5 minutes. The TruePoint alert that supposedly triggered the stop had logged 5 minutes after the subject of that stop was already in a hospital bed. Either the system had catastrophic latency issues that made it functionally useless, or the alert had been entered after the fact. Prakash had moved to look over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then that's a documented timestamp from a third-party system. County-managed server, Doyle said quietly. The logs are supposed to be tamper-evident. Supposed to be, Emily said. But if someone at the county level had administrative access, then supposed to be and actually are become two different things. She set the sheets down. I need these copied, digitally, not just paper. I can scan them somewhere that isn't the hospital server, Emily said. Your personal email. Your phone. Somewhere that Morrison can't access. Doyle looked at her. He was 24 years old and had been a nurse for less than 2 years, and she was asking him to do something that could complicate his career considerably. And she knew that, and she let him see that she knew it. Okay, he said. He took the sheets and walked to the far end of the charge desk, away from the office sightlines, and pulled out his phone. Prakash moved beside her. He was looking at the department, not at her, in the way he did when he was thinking. Reyes can corroborate some of this, he said. He was on the convoy. He saw the sequence of events when we arrived. What did he see? Rutherford had you in the parking lot when we came in. A pause. He had his hand on his weapon. Emily was quiet. Not drawn, Prakash said, but positioned. And you were in handcuffs. She'd been in handcuffs. She remembered the cold of them, the specific weight, and she remembered that she had not let herself think about it while it was happening, because thinking about things while they were happening was a luxury that situations like that didn't allow. How long? She asked. Maybe 90 seconds before the dog went. Dawes tried to correct, but Kira, the dog's name. Apparently she wasn't having it. Something shifted in his voice, a fraction. She remembered you. I worked with her for 6 months. 7, Prakash said. But yeah, she looked toward the bay where Reyes was. His lacerations closed. He can walk. If you want him available for a statement, he already knows. Prakash pulled his phone from his jacket. I texted him while you were talking to Briggs. He looked at the screen. I also made that call, and the second person in Morrison's office is a man named Walsh. Gregory Walsh. He's listed as a county technology procurement officer. Prakash kept his voice level. He's also listed on the TruePoint contract as a county liaison. He signed the performance review that authorized the second phase of the county's contract with TruePoint Technologies. Emily let that settle. The shape of it was becoming clearer, not fully visible yet, but clearer. Rutherford generated arrests using TruePoint alerts. His success rate justified the county's investment. Walsh's office authorized the contract renewal based on that success rate. And somewhere in that chain, someone had decided that the arrests didn't need to be entirely real as long as the numbers were. Morrison knew, she said. Probably not the specifics, Prakash said. Morrison seems like the kind of man who prefers not to know specifics. But he knew enough to try to make me disappear tonight. Yeah. She looked at the office. Through the glass, she could see the shapes of 2 people, Morrison and Walsh. She assumed, though Rutherford had been in there too, and she couldn't tell from here whether he'd left again. I want to talk to Morrison, she said. Prakash looked at her. Emily, not a confrontation. I want to look at him. She paused. I want to see his face when he realizes what the timestamps say. That's not a great strategy. I know. She picked up the copies of the documents. Doyle had handed her the phone with photos of both sheets, which she forwarded to her own number without ceremony. But I've been doing not great strategy all night, and it's gotten me further than the good strategy would have. Prakash was quiet for a moment. Then I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know. He fell into step beside her. I'm doing it anyway. They walked to Morrison's office together. Emily knocked twice, the way she always knocked 2 short raps, the knock of someone who intended to enter regardless of the answer. She opened the door. Morrison was behind his desk. Walsh was in the chair to his left, 50s, receding hair, the kind of face that was designed to blend into rooms and succeeded at it. Rutherford was standing near the window, and when the door opened, all 3 of them did the specific thing that groups of people do when they've been caught mid-sentence in a conversation they didn't expect to be interrupted. Emily, Morrison said. He recovered first, but not as fast as usual. I told you. I have a question about documentation, Emily said. She stepped into the office. Prakash came in behind her and did not take a seat, because there were only 2 chairs and Rutherford had the window, and Prakash's positioning was a choice. The TruePoint alert for Mr. Briggs's vehicle is timestamped at 22:19. His hospital intake is timestamped at 22:14. I'd like to understand how that works. Walsh's face did something very small and very controlled. If she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. Morrison said, that's not because the way TruePoint is designed, Emily continued. The alert precedes the stop. That's the whole premise. The system identifies the vehicle, generates the alert. The officer responds. But Briggs was already in this building when his alert logged. She let that sit. So either the system has a significant latency problem that makes it functionally useless for its stated purpose, or the alert was entered after the fact. Rutherford said, that document is part of an active. It's in the hospital's incident file, Emily said. Submitted by you as supporting documentation for why Mr. Briggs was brought in under police custody. That makes it available to the clinical team managing his care. She looked at Morrison. Is that correct? Morrison said nothing. She set the phone on his desk. Screen up, both time-stamped images side by side. Walsh looked at the phone, then at Rutherford. It was a very fast look, barely a half second, but it was the look of 2 people who had a shared understanding of what was happening and were trying to determine whether the other one was going to hold. I think Prakash said, from near the door, that this would be a good time for everyone in this room to stop talking and start calling their lawyers. That landed differently than Emily expected. Morrison went pale, not dramatically, just a degree or 2. The specific pallor of someone whose internal calculation has just come up with a number they didn't want. Walsh's expression flattened into something professionally neutral. And Rutherford looked at Emily with an expression she'd seen before, in other rooms, in worse places. The look of a man who had decided that if the situation was going to collapse, he was going to try to take the exit that suited him best. He took a step toward her, not aggressive, measured. The step of someone establishing proximity. Hartwell, you've been out of line all night. You were removed from this building twice under legal authority. You returned both times against explicit instruction, And now you're in my CO's office, making accusations that your commanding supervisor is Captain Marcus Hale, Prakash said without inflection. He's not in this room. Rutherford's step stopped. I'm familiar with the county sheriff's department command structure, Prakash continued. I made some calls while I was waiting for my men to come out of surgery. Captain Hale's name comes up in the TruePoint contract documentation. He paused, twice. The room held for a long moment. Then Walsh said, very quietly, to no one in particular, I need to make a phone call. I'd recommend doing that outside this room, Prakash said. On the record. Walsh stood. He looked at Morrison once a look, with a whole conversation in it, none of it good, and walked out of the office. The door didn't slam. It closed softly, which was somehow worse. Morrison looked at his desk, at the phone, at Emily's face, and then away from it. I want to be very clear, he said, in a voice that was trying to find steadiness and not quite getting there. I acted in good faith on the information I was given. I know, Emily said. Write that down. She picked up her phone, walked out of the office. Prakash came behind her, pulling the door closed. In the corridor, he said nothing for a moment. Then Hale's name is actually on the contract documentation. That wasn't a bluff. I know, Emily said. I figured. How? Because Walsh looked at Rutherford when you said it, not at you. If Hale was just an incidental name, he'd have looked at you. She kept walking. He looked at Rutherford because Hale is the shared problem. The three of them. Prakash walked beside her. You're going to be okay with what happens next. She stopped, looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, the next part isn't going to be quiet. Investigators, formal statements, the whole thing. If this goes where I think it goes, he paused. Your name doesn't stay small. She looked at the department around them. Bay 2's monitors were stable. Bay 1 was cleared and being reset. From the OR wing, she could see the sign above the double doors that said Surgical Suite B, and she knew Torelli was on the other side of it, being put back together by people who knew what the pleural scarring looked like, because she'd made sure they knew. I didn't come back to this building tonight to stay small, she said. Prakash nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then didn't, which was also something she remembered about him. They walked back to the main floor. The next 2 hours were a different kind of work, not clinical logistical, procedural, the particular labor of a situation that has shifted from acute crisis to something that would take longer and require more patience. Reyes gave a statement to Prakash's aide, a petty officer named Gutierrez, who had a tablet and a very precise way of asking questions. Doyle sent his documentation to 3 separate places on Emily's instruction. Briggs, still in Bay 4 with his broken arm, gave a recorded account of the stop to Gutierrez as well comms sequential, the account of a man who installed the systems he was describing and understood them from the inside out. Emily wrote her own account. She wrote it longhand first, which she always did when precision mattered, then typed it into a document on her own phone. She included timestamps, patient names where permitted, clinical decisions, and the basis for each one, and the conversation with Walsh and Morrison verbatim, as close as she could reconstruct it. She was finishing the last page when Keisha sat down beside her in the break room. Okonkwo is awake, Keisha said. He's asking for his phone. Torelli is still in post-op but stable. Reyes is trying to sign himself out AMA. He can leave, Emily said without looking up. His lacerations closed. He's neurologically intact. He knows the concussion protocols. He keeps asking the nurses if you're still here. Emily looked up. Why? Keisha raised an eyebrow. I didn't ask. Emily looked back down. Tell him I'm here. She finished the document. Saved it in 4 places. Sent it to her own email with a subject line that was just the date. Outside the break room, the department had found its post-crisis equilibrium, quieter, slower, the specific tiredness of a staff that had been running on adrenaline and was now metabolizing the end of it. It was almost 3 in the morning. She was on her way back to the floor when Doyle appeared again, and his face had an expression she hadn't seen from him all night, not nervous, not urgent. Careful. The face of someone holding something they weren't sure what to do with. I pulled the full TruePoint alert log, he said, not just Briggs's. The whole county record for the last 8 months, which is publicly accessible because they released it as part of the contract justification. Emily stopped. Rutherford has 43 TruePoint-assisted arrests on record, Doyle said. In 8 months. I looked it up. That's more than triple the county average for officer stops. How many have timestamp inconsistencies? Doyle held up his phone. I flagged 11 so far. I haven't finished checking. Emily took the phone, looked at the spreadsheet. He'd built arrest log on one side, TruePoint alert timestamps on the other, color-coded in yellow where the timing didn't line up. 11 yellow rows. She scrolled through them slowly. Some of these are older, she said. This one's from October. October was the same month TruePoint went live in the county, Doyle said. So if these are wrong, the system was being manipulated from the beginning, Emily said. Or the system itself is flawed, Doyle said, which would be worse, Emily said. If the system itself generates retroactive logs, then every contract Rutherford sold on the back of TruePoint is built on a technology that doesn't function as described. Doyle looked at her. That's a lot of contracts. She handed the phone back. Don't show this to anyone in this building. Not yet. When? She thought for a moment about the shape of the next few hours. About the investigators who would arrive because they would arrive. She could feel the machinery of that already moving. About Hale and Walsh and Morrison and the particular way institutional cover worked, the way it required everyone in the chain to hold at exactly the same moment. When someone shows up with a badge that isn't Rutherford's, she said. He nodded. She turned back toward the floor. She was passing the main entrance when the doors opened, and Dale Rutherford walked back in. Not through the administrative entrance this time, the main doors, the public entrance, with two men she didn't recognize behind him, and the particular energy of someone who has made a decision and intends to execute it before the conditions change. He saw Emily Hartwell. His voice was different, now tighter, clipped. The voice of a man who had been in that office making calls and had received instructions and was now operating on those instructions. I need you to come with me. I told you you're being placed under arrest. The department went quiet. Not fully monitors kept beeping. An IV pump alarmed somewhere. The background noise of a working hospital didn't stop, but the human element of it. The nurses and techs and the resident near Bay 1. All of it went briefly, collectively still. On what charge? Prakash's voice from the corridor behind her. He'd been in the corridor for the last hour. Emily hadn't known that until right now. Obstruction of a law enforcement investigation, Rutherford said. Filing a false complaint. And impersonating, he paused. One beat impersonating a licensed medical professional. The word hit the room the way he'd intended it to. Emily heard someone near the charge desk make a small sound. She has a nursing license, Keisha said. Sharp, from the other side of the room. That's under review, Rutherford said. By who? Emily asked. The state licensing board received a complaint tonight. She looked at him. He looked back. He had the expression of someone who had spent the last 90 minutes on the phone, ensuring that the architecture of this moment was in place before he walked back through the door. The complaint was filed by Dr. Morrison, Rutherford said. Based on clinical conduct tonight, Emily didn't move. She felt the room tilting, not literally, just the specific feeling of a situation applying pressure to a structure to see what it would yield. She's not going anywhere, Prakash said, moving up beside her. Commander, I've been patient with. She's not going anywhere, Prakash said again. Same tone, same volume, identical. And something about the exact repetition of it, the refusal to escalate, the refusal to modulate, made Rutherford stop. The two men behind Rutherford were looking at Prakash's uniform, at his rank insignia, at the security personnel still stationed near the entrance who had been there all night and had not left. Emily looked at Rutherford's hands, not at his face, not at his radio, his hands. His right hand was near his weapon in the same positioned way that Prakash had described from the parking lot earlier. Not drawn, just present. She had seen that before too. Not here, elsewhere. In places that were nothing like a hospital corridor. In situations that had gone badly in the specific way that situations went when someone with authority decided that the consequence of being caught was worse than whatever they were about to do. I'd like to call my lawyer, Emily said. You can do that at the... I'd like to do it here. She held his gaze, in front of witnesses, with the security cameras running. She did not look at the camera above the entrance, but she knew it was there. That's my right. Rutherford looked at her for a long moment. The two men behind him exchanged something that wasn't quite a glance too small for that, but something. Then one of them, the one on the left, the one she didn't recognize, said quietly to Rutherford, Dale, not here. And Rutherford's jaw tightened, and his hand moved away from his weapon, and he said, tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. If you're not at the sheriff's office by 8, I'll come back with a warrant. He turned and walked out. The two men followed. The doors closed. The department breathed. Emily stood still for a moment. Then she walked to the charge desk, picked up the desk phone, and dialed a number from memory, a number she hadn't called in 4 years, that she'd kept in the back of her mind the way she kept other things that were too important to write down. It rang twice, a voice answered. She recognized it immediately, older now, slightly hoarser, but the same voice. It's Hartwell, she said. I need you. A pause. 3 seconds. Where are you? Montana, I have a situation. Timestamp issue with a law enforcement tech system, the voice said, which was not what she'd called to say, but which meant the person on the other end had already been hearing things, which meant the network she'd once belonged to was already aware that something was happening in Harlow Ridge tonight. Yes, she said, and more. How much more? Emily looked at the department around her, at Doyle with his phone and his spreadsheet, at Keisha holding the floor together with 48 hours under her belt, at Reyes, who had just appeared in the corridor in a hospital gown, with his laceration freshly closed, and a look on his face that said he'd been planning to leave and had changed his mind, at Prakash, who was watching her from across the room, with the careful expression she'd once known as well as her own face. Enough, she said into the phone. Enough that you should get someone here before 8 a.m. The voice on the other end said, I'll make some calls. I know, Emily said. So will they. She hung up, set the phone down, looked at the doors Rutherford had walked out of, and then looked at the timestamp at the top of the charge desk monitor, 3:17 a.m., 4 hours and 43 minutes. She turned back to the department because there were still patients who needed attending, and time was not something she could afford to waste. She was halfway to Bay 1 when the charge desk phone rang. Doyle answered it. He listened for a moment, and his face changed. He looked at Emily. It's for you, he said. It's the state licensing board. Emily stopped walking. They say the complaint against your license, Doyle said, and his voice was very careful, was filed at 11:58 p.m. She knew what was coming before he finished. She knew it from the particular quality of his voice, from the look on his from the shape of the space between his words. 11:58, Doyle said, which is 40 minutes before Morrison told Rutherford he'd filed it, Emily said. The silence stretched. He didn't file it tonight, Doyle said. It was already filed. Before Rutherford even came back in. Before they talked in the office. The complaint was all ready. He stopped, looked at her. This wasn't reactive, Emily said quietly. They planned this before the patients arrived. The German Shepherd made a sound from near the entrance, a low, alert sound. Nothing aggressive, just attention. Emily looked at the door. Through the glass of the main entrance, she could see Rutherford's vehicle still in the parking lot. Engine off, lights off, parked where it had no reason to be parked if he'd genuinely left for the night, and in the driver's seat, barely visible through the tinted glass, a shape that was not moving and was not leaving. Rutherford's vehicle sat in the parking lot like a held breath. Emily stood at the main entrance glass and looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. He wasn't waiting because he thought she'd run. He was waiting because he'd been told to wait, which meant someone on the other end of his radio was still managing the sequence, still trying to control how this unfolded. The fact that he was visible was either carelessness or a message, and Rutherford didn't do carelessness. She turned away from the glass, Doyle. She kept her voice at its normal volume. Screenshot that timestamp from the licensing board call. Time, date, the board rep's name if you got it. Lena Marsh, Doyle said. He was already on his phone. She gave her name. She seemed like she was calling because she was uncomfortable with the timing. Did she say that? Not directly. But she asked me twice if anyone else had been informed. He looked up. I think she was trying to tell us something. Call her back. Ask her to send confirmation of the original filing timestamp in writing. Email official letterhead if she can. Doyle moved to the desk. Prakash was at Emily's shoulder. The vehicle, he said. I know, if he's been told to wait until a specific time, 4 hours and change until his deadline. She looked at the clock. But if backup is arriving before 8, the window he has to work with is smaller than he planned for. He doesn't know about the call you made. No, she thought for a moment. But Walsh does. Walsh has been making his own calls. Whatever network he has access to, it's moving. Prakash was quiet for a beat. The person you called. How fast can they move depends who they call. She paused. Fast enough. If they believe me, do they? She looked at him. He was asking the real question, not whether the person on the phone believed her, but whether she had the credibility to make this work, whether 4 years of distance and quiet and deliberate invisibility had eroded the standing she'd once had in rooms where these things got decided. I don't know, she said, which was more honest than she'd been with him all night. We'll find out. She left him at the entrance and went back to the break room. Not to sit, she wouldn't sit. Not with Rutherford in that parking lot, but to think in a space that wasn't the middle of the floor, where every person who looked at her was trying to read what came next from her expression. She sat down anyway. Her feet registered the relief, and she ignored it. The complaint timestamp was the piece that changed the shape of everything. It meant the plan to remove her license hadn't been improvised in Morrison's office after the patients arrived. It meant someone had known, before the military convoy pulled into the Harlow Ridge parking lot, that Emily was going to be a problem worth neutralizing. That implied foreknowledge of her background, not the nursing career, the other part. The part she'd kept off every official document she'd filed in Montana. Someone had done research. Someone had known who she was before tonight. She thought about Rutherford's first moment in the ER, the way he'd scanned her badge. The pause before he said her name. At the time, she'd read it as the standard dismissal she received from men like him. Nurse, woman, inconvenience. Now she read it differently. The pause had been recognition, not dismissal. He'd known the name before he said it. She pulled her phone and looked at her own contact list. The number she'd just called wasn't stored under a name, it was stored as a series of digits that looked like a plumbing contractor's line, which was intentional and old, and a habit she'd never broken. She scrolled past it and opened a different number. This one was stored as M. Okafor, and she hadn't called it in 2 years. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered, rough with sleep. Hartwell. Miriam. Are you in Denver? Salt Lake. Conference. What time is it? A little after 3. A pause. The sound of movement. Miriam Okafor, sitting up, turning on a light, doing the fast transition from asleep to present that certain careers required you to be able to do. I'm listening. I need a federal attorney contact in Montana who can be operational in the next 3 hours. I have documented evidence of law enforcement misconduct, a tampered technology contract, and a licensing complaint that was filed before the incident it claims to respond to. Silence for 2 seconds. Say that last part again. Emily said it again. That's not just misconduct, Miriam said. That's a premeditated setup.
Yes.
How solid is the documentation? Time-stamped system logs, intake records, and a field technician who installed the system and can testify to how it's supposed to function. Plus a military officer and 3 service members who were present for the events tonight. Civilian witnesses, hospital nursing staff, charge nurse, a first-year nurse, and the technician in custody. Who's the officer? Commander Neil Prakash, Navy. He's been here all night. He's willing to make a statement. Another pause. This one longer. Emily could hear Miriam thinking not literally, but the quality of the silence was specific. The silence of someone organizing information into categories of viable and not viable, urgent and not urgent. Miriam Okafor had spent 15 years as a federal public defender before moving to private practice, and she had the specific cognitive architecture of someone who had learned to build cases under pressure. I have a contact in Billings, Miriam said. Federal. He's DOJ, not private, but he's someone who can move tonight if the evidence is what you're describing. It is. I'm going to call him in the next 5 minutes. His name is Aaron Chu. He'll call you directly. She paused. Emily, are you safe right now? The officer who's been managing this situation is still in the parking lot. He told me to present at the sheriff's office at 8 a.m. or he'd come back with a warrant. Don't go at 8, Miriam said immediately. Not without Chu or someone like him standing next to you. I know. I'll make the call. Stay put. She hung up. Emily set the phone on the break room table and looked at it for a moment. Then she got up, poured herself a cup of whatever the break room had passing for coffee, something that had been sitting in the carafe since the previous shift and had achieved the specific texture of reconstituted regret, drank half of it, standing over the sink, and went back to the floor. The department at 3:20 in the morning had the particular quality of aftermath. The elevated trauma state had metabolized. The surgical teams had cycled back to their wing, and what remained was the normal skeleton crew, managing the normal volume of a Tuesday night in a mid-sized Montana hospital. Bay 1 and 2 were cleared. Bay 3 had a new patient, an elderly man with chest pain who had arrived by walk-in and was waiting on an EKG. Bay 4 still had Briggs, asleep now, his arm immobilized, a nasal cannula running low-flow oxygen more for monitoring purposes than clinical necessity. Reyes was still there. He'd gotten dressed at some point his own clothes. Someone had apparently brought a bag from the convoy vehicle and was sitting in a chair near the entrance with the particular stillness of someone who was not going to leave, regardless of what the discharge paperwork said. He looked up when Emily came through. Torelli's out of post-op, he said. I just heard from the nurse. Good, how's he doing? Talking. Complaining about the food already, so. A ghost of something in his voice. His family's driving up from Missoula. Emily nodded. She looked at the parking lot through the glass. Rutherford's vehicle was still there. Reyes followed her gaze. He hasn't moved. No. You want me to go out there? No, Emily said, more sharply than she intended. She softened it. No. I don't want anything on record that looks like escalation from our side. Reyes looked at her. Our side, he said. Not quite a question. She didn't answer that directly. When Gutierrez took your statement, Did you include the parking lot sequence? The timing of the lights before you arrived? Everything I saw from the vehicle. Prakash confirmed it separately. He paused. Okonkwo is awake, by the way. He's asking to give a statement too. He was conscious when they brought him in. He saw the initial parking lot situation through the ambulance window. Emily looked at Reyes from the ambulance. We came in right behind the convoy vehicles. He would have had a direct sight line to where you were standing. Get Gutierrez, she said. She stood near the entrance while Gutierrez went to post-op to take Okonkwo's statement. Prakash appeared beside her without announcement. He did that, she'd forgotten, materialized in spaces, without the usual acoustic warning of footsteps. Walsh left the building, Prakash said. About 20 minutes ago. He took the administrative exit. Did you see which direction? North. Toward downtown. She thought about that. Walsh leaving meant he'd either gotten instructions to distance himself, or he'd decided the situation had moved past what he could manage from inside. Either way, his departure from the building was not the same as his departure from the problem. The contract documentation, she said. Is it publicly filed? The initial contract, yes. The performance reviews and renewal authorizations are county records, technically public, but you'd need to submit a records request and wait 30 days. Or, she heard it in his voice, or someone who has to understand to request an emergency disclosure. He paused. I made a call earlier to Naval Legal Services. They have standing in cases involving active duty personnel. If TruePoint technology was used in an environment where military personnel were present, and if the reliability of that technology is relevant to an ongoing investigation, that's a stretch. It's the kind of stretch that Naval Legal Services is very good at making, Prakash said. The request went in 40 minutes ago. Emily looked at him. I've been busy, he said. She almost said something. Instead, she turned back to the glass. Rutherford's car. Still there. A shape in the driver's seat that wasn't moving. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number with a 406 area code, Montana. She answered. Miss Hartwell. A man's voice, alert in the way of someone accustomed to being called at odd hours. Aaron Chu. Miriam Okafor asked me to call Mr. Thank you for responding. I've been briefed on the outline. I want to see the documentation before I characterize what we're dealing with, but the timestamp discrepancy alone is significant. If the licensing complaint was filed before the precipitating incident, that's not misconduct. That's conspiracy, he paused. Where are you right now? Harlow Ridge Medical Center. Harlow Ridge, Montana. Okay, I'm in Billings, which is 2 hours out. I'm not going to make it there before 8. A beat. But I can call the county sheriff's office and formally advise them that you're represented and that any attempt to compel your presence without counsel present constitutes. That'll buy time, Emily said. But Rutherford is still in the parking lot. A silence. He's physically present outside the facility.
Yes.
Has he attempted to re-enter? Not since he left approximately 45 minutes ago.
Okay.
Chu's voice had shifted tighter, more focused. I'm going to make 2 calls right now. One to the county, one to the state attorney general's office. The AG's office has a duty officer for situations involving potential civil rights violations. The timestamp discrepancy and the premeditated nature of the licensing complaint may qualify. Another pause. Are the military personnel still on site? Commander Prakash is standing next to me, Emily said. Prakash, who had clearly heard this, said, Commander Neil Prakash, U.S. Navy. We have 3 additional personnel currently in the medical center, 2 in post-surgical recovery. Can I speak with the commander? Emily handed the phone over. She listened to Prakash's side of the conversation, precise, professional, the specific cadence of someone who knew how to give a statement without editorializing. He'd done this before, of course he had. While he talked, she walked to the charge desk and pulled the security camera access log. Hospitals documented who accessed the camera system, and she wanted to know whether anyone had been in the security system tonight, in the window between Rutherford's initial departure and his return. The log showed 2 access events. The first at 23:42, which was the hospital's standard shift change review. The second at 1:17 less than 2 hours ago from an administrative terminal, Morrison's office terminal. She photographed the log, added it to the chain. Prakash handed her phone back. He's making the calls, he said. He said don't open the door for Rutherford under any circumstances until he's confirmed with the county. He's going to have someone from the AG's office call the sheriff's department directly. How long? He said 30 minutes. She looked at the clock. 3:31 a.m. 30 minutes would be 4:01. 4 hours before Rutherford's self-imposed deadline. The window was narrowing on both sides. Keisha materialized at her elbow with the expression of a woman who had been charge nurse through worse nights than this and was still standing because the alternative was not standing, which wasn't an option. Lena Marsh from the licensing board sent the written confirmation, Keisha said. She had a tablet. On the screen was an email official header, timestamps, the board's case number. Filed at 11:58 p.m. The complainant's name is listed. Emily looked at the tablet. The complainant was not Gary Morrison. It was Marcus Hale. Captain Marcus Hale, County Sheriff's Department, had filed a complaint against Emily Hartwell's nursing license at 11:58 p.m. before the military convoy arrived, before the mass casualty event, before Emily had returned to the building the second time, before any of the events that the complaint claimed to be responding to had occurred. She looked at the name for a long moment. Around her, the hospital breathed and beeped and functioned in its low-battery nighttime mode, and she stood in the middle of it with a tablet in her hands and the understanding of exactly what had been built here settling into its final shape. Hale had known she worked at Harlow Ridge. He'd known her name. He'd known that if Rutherford encountered her tonight, it would become complicated, and he'd prepared the licensing complaint as a preemptive measure, which meant someone had told him about her before tonight. Someone had flagged her name. The TruePoint contract wasn't just Rutherford. It was Hale. It was Walsh. It was a structure that required a specific kind of protection, the kind you built before problems arrived, not after. And somewhere in the last 8 months, someone in that structure had noticed a nurse in a Montana ER whose name came back with a history that made her dangerous to have nearby. Keisha, Emily said. Who processes the staff directory updates at this hospital? Keisha blinked. HRY. When was the last time my record was updated in the external system? The one that publishes to the county health network. Keisha took the tablet back, navigated, typed, looked at the result. 6 weeks ago. Standard update. She scrolled. There was an access event on the record external query from a county IP address. 6 weeks ago. Someone had queried Emily's record from a county IP address 6 weeks ago, and 6 weeks later, here was Hale's name on a premeditated licensing complaint. She thought about Thomas Briggs again, a field technician who installed TruePoint units, who knew how the system worked, who had been stopped on Route 9, a route where he'd installed the very units that flagged him. The coincidence of Briggs and Emily in the same building on the same night was not a coincidence. Briggs was here because Rutherford had targeted him, specifically a man who knew too much about the system's mechanics, and recently, she would bet, said something to someone about the alert sequencing that hadn't sounded right to him. What does Briggs do when he's not installing TruePoint units? She asked aloud. Keisha stared at her. I have no idea. Doyle looked up from the charge desk. He's a county field tech. It's on his intake form. His employer is listed as Doyle Scrolled Meridian Infrastructure Services. They're a county contractor. Pull Meridian, Emily said. See if they're listed anywhere in the TruePoint contract documentation. I don't have access to. It's public record, Prakash said from behind her. He had his own phone out. Give me 2 minutes. She waited. The minute hand on the wall clock moved. From down the hall, she could hear the distant sound of a post-op monitor cycling through its check, which meant Torelli's room was close and someone was watching him, which was good, because Torelli's presence here, and Torelli's history and the specific reason Prakash's unit had been in this part of Montana at all, were questions she hadn't fully answered yet. Prakash lowered his phone. Meridian Infrastructure Services is listed as a subcontractor in the TruePoint County deployment documentation. They handled physical installation of all 16 units currently active in the county. He paused. Briggs's company installed the system. Briggs would have access to the installation data, the calibration records, the original baseline logs, and if those logs showed discrepancies between the system's design behavior and its actual alert patterns, he'd know. He'd be able to testify to it, which makes him not just an incidental arrest, Prakash said. It makes him a witness removal. The word sat there. Not an accusation, a structural observation, the kind that required documentation to become anything more than conjecture. But the shape of it fit everything else. Briggs hadn't been stopped because of a vehicle alert. He'd been stopped because someone had run his name through an employment database, found his connection to Meridian, and decided he needed to be neutralized before he talked to anyone with the standing to investigate. Rutherford, in trying to manufacture his 44th successful arrest, had pulled a thread that was now unraveling the entire garment. Emily walked to Bay 4. Briggs was awake. He'd been asleep 20 minutes ago, but he was awake now, sitting up, watching the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of someone running the same sequence of thoughts through their head for the 4th or 5th time. Briggs, she came to the side of the bed, kept her voice low. What did you report? He looked at her. What? In the last month. At work. Did you report anything about the TruePoint installation to your supervisor, to anyone at Meridian, or to anyone at the county? He was quiet for a moment. The right kind of quiet, not evasive, just careful. The quiet of a man deciding whether the person asking the question deserved the answer. 3 weeks ago, he said, I filed an internal report with Meridian's compliance officer about alert sequence anomalies. What kind of anomalies? The system was logging alerts in clusters. 3-4 in one shift, all from the same unit, then nothing for 2 weeks. That's not how the system is calibrated. He shifted, winced at the arm, but the arrest rate from those units was listed as normal in the county reports, which meant either the system was malfunctioning and no one was reporting it, or someone was manually adjusting the logs. Yeah, he looked at her. The compliance officer told me it wasn't actionable, that it was a calibration variance within acceptable parameters. A pause. Acceptable parameters don't make sense if the system is generating arrest correlations from non-functional alert data. What happened after you filed the report? Nothing, Briggs said, for about 2 weeks. And then last Thursday, Meridian called me in and put me on administrative hold, pending review of my work quality. Emily heard it land. Administrative hold. 3 weeks after an internal compliance report. 1 week before he was stopped on a road where he'd installed the very units flagging his vehicle. I need you to repeat that to a federal attorney, she said. His name is Aaron Chu. He's going to call this number in the next hour. She wrote the number on the patient intake clipboard at the foot of the bed. Don't talk to anyone else before you talk to him. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. You're not just a nurse, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm exactly a nurse, she said. That's been the whole problem tonight. She left Bay 4. The clock on the wall said 3:47. Chu had said 30 minutes. He was 11 minutes past that, which meant his calls had encountered something, resistance or complication, or the specific friction of waking up the right people at the wrong hour. She was at the charge desk when her phone rang. Chu. Okay, he said without preamble. The AG's duty officer is on it. He pulled the licensing board timestamp. He's seen the preliminary documentation from the Naval Legal Services request, and he's making contact with the county sheriff's department through official channels. A pause. But here's the complication. There was always a complication. Hale was contacted 10 minutes ago by someone in his department about the AG's inquiry, Chu said. He's not at his office. He's not at home. His department hasn't been able to reach him in the last 40 minutes. Emily looked at Rutherford's car through the glass. And Rutherford, she said. His radio has gone dark, Chu said. As of 18 minutes ago, he stopped responding to dispatch. She stared at the car. Dark windows, engine off. A shape in the driver's seat that wasn't moving. Mr. Chu, she said. Is there any scenario in which a law enforcement officer going dark before an AG inquiry is anything other than what it sounds like? No, Chu said, there isn't. She hung up, looked at Prakash. He'd heard enough of it from her side to understand. Dawes, he said without raising his voice. The petty officer near the entrance straightened. Get outside. Uniform presence visible right now. Dawes moved. Emily watched the young petty officer push through the main doors and step into the cold Montana air, and she watched Rutherford's car, and she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On 6, the engine turned over. On 7, the headlights came on. On 8, the vehicle moved not toward the exit, not toward the road, but toward the access drive along the side of the building, toward the administrative entrance, toward the part of the hospital that didn't have Dawes in front of it, and wasn't being watched by anyone except the security cameras that Emily now knew had been accessed from Morrison's office terminal 2 hours ago. He's going for the administrative entrance, Emily said. Prakash was already moving. He hit the radio on his shoulder military frequency, not hospital, and said 3 words in a clipped cadence that she recognized as a unit designation and a vector. From outside, she heard Dawes's boots on the pavement change direction. And from down the corridor, from the direction of the administrative wing, she heard a door, not closing, opening. And then she heard Morrison's voice, tired, unhappy, the voice of a man who had convinced himself all night that he could manage this, saying, Dale, I told you not to come back through. And then nothing. A silence that was a different quality from the hospital's normal silence, a silence with a shape to it that she recognized from other corridors and other 4A. moments. Emily was already moving toward the administrative wing when Keisha grabbed her arm. Don't, Keisha said. He's in the building. I know. But if you go back there and something, Keisha stopped. Her grip was stronger than it looked. Let Prakash. Prakash had already gone past them. Two of his security personnel with him, she hadn't even seen them enter. They'd been outside and were now inside, which was the particular quality of people trained to move without announcing it. Emily stopped, stood in the corridor, let Keisha keep hold of her arm. From the administrative wing, the sound of voices, Prakash's level, Rutherford's, no longer. Then silence again, a long one. Then Prakash came back around the corner alone. He walked directly to Emily and he said, very calmly, he had Hale on the phone. They were trying to pull the security footage. The camera access, Emily said. Morrison's terminal at 117. Morrison claims Rutherford used his terminal. Rutherford says Morrison requested it. Prakash looked at her steadily. Either way, the AG's duty officer is now on a call with state police, which means this is no longer a county matter. And Rutherford? Prakash was quiet for a moment. He handed over his radio and his service weapon, he said, voluntarily, which means his lawyer told him to, which means he's been on the phone with his lawyer for longer than we knew. Emily stood in the corridor of Harlow Ridge Medical Center at 4:12 in the morning, and she thought about the volunteer surrender of a weapon, about what that meant, about what Rutherford knew was coming, about the shape of a man who had spent 8 months manufacturing a record and had watched it become the thing that would bury him. His lawyer told him to cooperate. Emily said yes, because cooperating is the only option that gives him anything to negotiate with. That would be my read. She thought about Hale, who was not at his office and not at his home and not answering his radio. She thought about Walsh, who had driven north 40 minutes ago and whose phone, she would bet, was also dark. They're going to try to make Rutherford the container, she said. Hale and Walsh. They're going to let him hold everything while they create distance. Probably. Rutherford knows that, yes, Prakash said. I think he figured that out about 20 minutes ago. She looked down the corridor. Doyle was at the end of it, watching. Keisha had finally let go of her arm. Reyes was visible through the main entrance glass, standing outside near Dawes, the two of them in the cold air, the German shepherd at Reyes's side, because Kira had apparently decided that Reyes was the next acceptable person in the hierarchy of people she'd tolerate. Emily's phone buzzed, a text from Chu, State Police and AG rep en route. ETA 60 minutes. Do not let anyone remove documentation from the facility. She looked at Morrison's office, down the hall. The door was open. Through it, she could see the desk, the diplomas on the wall, the chair he'd been sitting in when he'd explained institutional context to her 4 years of Tuesday nights ago. She walked to the office, stood in the doorway. The computer terminal was on. The screen had been partially cleared. Someone had navigated away from whatever they'd been looking at. But the browser history wasn't cleared, and she could see in the address bar's autocomplete the URL of the county's TruePoint administrative portal. She did not touch the keyboard. She took a photograph of the screen, of the URL, of the open session indicator that showed the login was still active. She stepped back out. Doyle was behind her. He'd seen it. He photographed it too, from a different angle, which gave them 2 independent verification points. Don't close that session, Emily said. Don't let anyone near that terminal until the AG's people arrive. What if Morrison is currently in the administrative corridor explaining to a Navy commander how his office terminal was used to access security camera footage at 1:17 in the morning? She looked at Doyle. He's going to be busy for a while. Doyle nodded. He stood in the doorway of Morrison's office, like a very young, very tired sentinel, and Emily walked back to the charge desk. And she sat down in the chair that was technically Keisha's chair, and she put both hands on the desk, and she stayed still. The clock moved to 4:19. 41 minutes until the state police arrived. Hale was missing. Walsh was unreachable. Rutherford was in the administrative wing with no weapon and a lawyer on the phone. Morrison's terminal held an open session to a portal it had no business accessing. And somewhere in the night outside, moving north on a road out of Harlow Ridge, was Gregory Walsh with whatever he'd taken from that meeting, whatever documentation he'd thought to grab, whatever part of the record he believed he could still shape if he got far enough ahead of the investigation. She picked up her phone. Called Chu Walsh, she said when he answered. He left the building 45 minutes ago, heading north. Do you have enough for already in the request? Chu said. State Police has a unit that should be about 20 minutes north of his likely position. But Emily, he paused the documentation Walsh had access to in that office. Do you know what was on Morrison's desk when they were in there? She thought about the brief moment she'd stood in the doorway. Walsh in the chair. A folder on Morrison's desk, she'd registered it peripherally and moved on, because there were more urgent things to look at. A folder with a blue cover and a county seal on the front. A folder she had not photographed. a folder that was no longer on the desk when she'd stood in the doorway 20 minutes ago. He took something, she said. Yeah, Chu said. I was afraid of that. She stood up, walked back down the corridor, past Morrison's office, past Doyle's standing sentinel, to the administrative entrance where Prakash was still managing whatever he was managing, in the corridor with Rutherford and the paperwork of a situation that had grown far past its original parameters. Prakash, she caught his eye. Walsh took a document from Morrison's office. Blue cover, county seal. Prakash looked at her. A beat. Can you describe the contents? No, I didn't see it clearly. He reached for his radio. And behind her, from down the hall, she heard Rutherford's voice, no longer controlled, no longer managed, the voice of a man whose lawyer had just told him something he hadn't expected to say. That file wasn't supposed to leave this building. The silence after it was the loudest thing she'd heard all night. That file wasn't supposed to leave this building. Rutherford said it the way people said things when they'd stopped calculating and started reacting, which was the most honest he'd been all night. The words were out before his lawyer could stop them. Emily heard the tinny protest from the phone pressed to his ear a half-second too late. And in the corridor of Harlow Ridge Medical Center at 4:19 in the morning, with Prakash standing 3 feet away and 2 state police personnel, somewhere in the night moving north toward Walsh's vehicle, those 9 words did more damage than anything Emily had said or documented in the previous 6 hours. Prakash looked at Rutherford. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Rutherford looked at the floor. Whatever his lawyer was saying, he'd stopped listening to it. Emily turned and walked back toward the main floor, because there was nothing more for her to do in that corridor, and because standing there watching a man understand the shape of his own collapse wasn't something she had any interest in doing. She'd seen enough of that kind of moment to know it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a long drive home on an empty tank. She sat at the charge desk. The clock said 4:22. She had 38 minutes until Aaron Chu had estimated the state police would arrive, though his estimates had already proven variable, and the cold specific fatigue of a person who has been running on controlled adrenaline for 7 hours was beginning to settle into her joints. Keisha set a cup of coffee in front of her. Not the break room carafe, something better, something that smelled like it had been made in the last 30 minutes, which meant Keisha had made it herself. You don't have to do that, Emily said. I know. Keisha sat in the adjacent chair. The charge desk was quiet. The department was in its absolute minimum at this hour. 2 nurses managing the floor, Doyle still standing sentinel outside Morrison's office. I want to ask you something. Okay. How long have you known? About Rutherford, I mean. About the system. Emily looked at the coffee. Tonight. Most of it. Tonight. But you knew something was wrong before the patients came in. I knew he needed the arrest on record more than it made sense to need it. The rest. She paused. The rest I figured out as it went. Keisha was quiet for a moment. The thing is, she said, I watched you get walked out of this building tonight. I watched Rutherford stand in the middle of my department and tell you to leave. And she stopped. I didn't say anything. Emily looked at her. I know why, Keisha said. I know all the reasons why. Morrison, the contract, 15 years of working with the sheriff's department without incident. I know the math I was doing in my head. She looked at her hands. But I still didn't say anything. And you came back anyway. You kept the floor running, Emily said. You gave me the chart when I asked for it. You're the reason Doyle trusted me enough to pull those logs. That's not the same. No, Emily said, it's not. But it's what you could do. And you did it. And that matters. Keisha looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her own coffee, and they sat in the particular silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing to elaborate, which was the kind of silence that only existed after a very long night. The state police arrived at 5:03 a.m., not the 60 minutes Chu had estimated, but 41, which suggested the AG's duty officer had applied more pressure than anticipated. There were 4 of them, plus a woman in civilian clothes who identified herself as Special Investigator Dana Holt from the Attorney General's office. She was 50-something, wore her gray hair short, and had the specific quality of someone who had been doing this work long enough to stop being surprised by anything and start being precise about everything. She came directly to Emily. Ms. Hartwell. Not a question, not a greeting, a confirmation.
Yes.
I've reviewed the preliminary documentation Mr. Chu sent. I need to walk through the timeline with you in detail. She had a recorder in her hand, already running. Are you willing to do that now? Yes. Before we start, do you want counsel present? Mr. Chu is 2 hours out. I'm willing to proceed without him. She paused. I've been waiting to say this out loud to the right person for approximately 5 hours. Holt almost smiled. Almost. Then let's begin. They sat in the break room because it was the only space with a door and a table, and Holt's 2 hours of questioning was the most thorough Emily had experienced since a debrief she'd given in a building that didn't exist on any public record 11 years and several lifetimes ago. Holt asked in sequence, and then non-sequentially, circling back to check consistency the way good investigators did. She asked about Briggs, about the timestamps, about the camera access log, about Morrison's terminal, about Rutherford's words in the corridor. She asked about the original confrontation in the ER and exactly what Emily had said and done, word by word, action by action, in the order it happened. Emily answered all of it the same way she'd done things all night, without performance, without elaboration, with the specific precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that the truth was most effective when it was told cleanly. When they finished, Holt turned off the recorder. She looked at Emily for a moment. "You have an interesting background for an ER nurse in Harlow Ridge, Montana," she said. It was not a question, but it had a question in it. "I have the background I have," Emily said. "The nursing license is real. Everything I did in this building tonight was within my clinical scope." "I know." Holt capped her pen. "I'm not questioning the nursing. I'm noting that the people who tried to discredit you tonight chose the wrong target, and I find it interesting that they didn't figure that out before they started." Emily thought about the 6-week-old query on her staff record. Someone had looked. They'd found a nurse with 4 years of Montana employment history and a clean record at Harlow Ridge. They hadn't looked far enough back, or they'd looked, and hadn't understood what they were reading. They saw the badge, Emily said. They didn't look behind it. Holt stood. That was their mistake. She walked out. Emily sat alone in the break room for a moment. The window above the sink showed the beginning of something not quite light yet, but the specific darkness that came just before it, the hour that was neither night nor morning, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the world was very quiet. She thought about nothing particular. That was unusual for her. Her mind was almost always working on something, processing, cataloging. But in that specific moment, sitting in the break room of the hospital she'd been thrown out of twice in the same night, she thought about nothing, and it felt briefly like relief. Then she got up and went back to work, because the Bay 3 patient with chest pain still needed his morning assessment, and Torelli's post-op check was due at 6, and Briggs was going to need transport arranged, now that the situation had stabilized enough for him to be discharged to something other than a sheriff's custody that no longer had standing. Walsh was stopped at 5:34 a.m. on Route 12, 47 miles north of Harlow Ridge, by a state police unit. The blue-covered county document was in his passenger seat. He was placed under investigative detention, and his phone was seized pursuant to an emergency warrant the AG's office had obtained while Emily was in the break room with Holt. She didn't learn the details until later, but the sequence mattered. Walsh stopped. Phone seized, the call log on that phone showing 11 outgoing calls in the 2 hours since he'd left the hospital, including 3 to Hale's personal cell and 2 to a number registered to TruePoint Technologies' general counsel. Hale was found at 6:15 a.m. in a motel outside of Roundup. He had checked in under his own name, which spoke either to panic or to the specific failure of imagination that came from spending too long in a position where no one had ever called him on anything. He was served with a material witness order and transported to Billings. Emily did not find out about Hale until 8:47 a.m., when Aaron Chu arrived at Harlow Ridge in a rental car with a travel mug and a stack of papers, and the particular efficiency of a man who had made very good use of a 2-hour drive. He found her at the nursing station, finishing her documentation of the overnight events, and he sat down beside her and briefed her in chronological order on what had happened to each person in the chain. Rutherford had been placed under formal investigation at 6-2A. His service weapon was in state police custody. His personnel file had been flagged for an independent audit. He had not been arrested yet. The investigation was still forming, the charges still being constructed, but his law enforcement certification had been administratively suspended, pending the outcome, which meant he could not work, could not carry, and could not represent himself as an officer while the process played out. His lawyer had issued a statement at 7 a.m., indicating he intended to cooperate fully, which Chu characterized as the legal equivalent of a person getting off a sinking ship while it was still sinking. Walsh's phone records were, according to Chu, a gift. The word he used was gift, which Emily noted and set aside for later consideration. Hale's personnel file was being reviewed by an independent auditor appointed by the State Attorney General's office. The True Point contract, all phases of it, including the county renewal authorization and the performance review Walsh had signed, had been placed under a formal hold pending investigation. True Point Technologies' legal team had issued a statement distancing the company from the alert log discrepancies, which suggested the company itself was either uninvolved or was sophisticated enough to begin separating itself from the county's misuse of its system before investigators formally distinguished between the two. Briggs's administrative hold at Meridian Infrastructure Services was reversed at 7:40 a.m., his supervisor apparently having received enough information about the preceding 12 hours to understand that maintaining it was not in anyone's interest. He was discharged from Harlow Ridge at 9 a.m. with a properly casted radial fracture, a documented statement in the AG's file, and Emily's cell number written on the back of a medication instruction sheet, which she'd given him because he'd asked, and because she couldn't think of a reason to say no. Morrison resigned. He submitted the resignation in writing to the hospital board at 7:15 a.m., before the board had formally convened to discuss the overnight events, which meant he'd made the decisions in somewhere in the pre-dawn hours, in whatever space he'd been in while Holt's people were walking his office, and had chosen the exit that cost him the least in the short term. Emily read the resignation letter when Keisha forwarded it to her 3 paragraphs, measured the language of a man who had spent his career perfecting the exit from rooms before they could close around him. It cited personal reasons and expressed appreciation for his tenure. It did not mention Thomas Briggs or Dale Rutherford or a blue-covered file or a terminal access event at 1:17 a.m. His name was in the AG's file. The investigation would find him regardless of where he resigned to. At 9:30 a.m., the licensing board's formal review of the complaint against Emily's nursing license was opened, reviewed, and closed. Lena Marsh sent the notification directly to Emily's phone, not a letter, not a formal document, a text. Complaint dismissed. Record clear LM. It was the most informal official communication Emily had ever received, and she appreciated it enormously. She was in Bay 3 when she got it. The chest pain patient from the night before had been admitted, his EKG showing a pattern that warranted a cardiology consult, and she'd been managing his transition to the cardiac floor for the last 40 minutes. She read the text, wrote it into the timeline document she'd been maintaining, and finished the transition notes. Prakash found her at 10:15. She was in the parking lot. Not leaving, she'd had a conversation with the interim charge nurse about covering the remainder of her shift, which the interim had declined because they were, in her words, not having this nurse leave before she absolutely had to, which was an uncharacteristically direct thing for the hospital bureaucracy to say, and Emily had taken it as the compliment it was. She was in the parking lot because the building had been full of people and noise for the last several hours, and she needed 5 minutes of sky. Montana in April at 10 in the morning had a particular quality: the air still cold, the light new and still at the angle where everything cast long shadows, the mountains visible to the west through the kind of clarity that only existed after you'd been awake all night. She was standing near the staff entrance, looking at those mountains, when she heard his footsteps. He stopped beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Okonkwo is going to make a full recovery," he said. "They confirmed this morning. The leg is intact." "Good. Torelli's asking to be discharged, which is a small pause premature, but his surgeon is working on it. Tell him 3 days minimum. The pleural margin needs time." "I'll tell him 4, Prakash said. "He'll negotiate down to 3. She almost smiled. He saw it. Emily. He turned slightly toward her. Not fully side by side, both still looking at the mountains. "I need to say something." "You don't have to, I do." He was quiet for a moment, arranging it. "When you left 4 years ago, I looked for you. I know. Not now, I wasn't trying to." He stopped. Started differently. "I needed to know you were all right. That's all. I needed to know you'd landed somewhere safe." She thought about the apartment with the other people's cooking smells. The cat named Sable. The photograph face down on the top shelf. "I landed." "Yeah," he looked at the mountains. "I see that." She turned to look at him then. Directly, the way she hadn't quite let herself do in the hours of the night, when there was always something else to look at, something more urgent to attend to. He looked like a man who had been awake for as long as she had, and had also spent those hours managing a situation that had required everything he had. The scar on his jaw was exactly as she remembered. The gray at his temples was new. "I'm not coming back," she said. Not harshly, just clearly. "To any of it. That part of my life is done." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to see you. In daylight. That's all." She looked at him. He looked back. And there was something in that, the simple fact of being seen, in daylight, by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and had crossed state lines in the middle of the night for reasons that had started as professional and somewhere along the way had become something else that she didn't have a clean, clinical term for, and so she let it be what it was. I have to finish my shift, she said. I know. She turned back toward the hospital entrance. Stopped. Tell Reyes his sutures come out in 7 days. He'll try to take them out himself at day 5. He shouldn't. How do you know he'll try to? Because he's that kind of person. She looked at him. The same way I know you'll make 3 more phone calls before you leave this parking lot. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile either. 6, he said. At least 6. She went back inside. The formal board meeting happened at 2 p.m. Emily attended it, which was not something she had been invited to do, but when she sat down in the 3rd row of the hospital conference room, with her documentation file in her hands, no one asked her to leave, which she took as institutional acknowledgement that the night had shifted certain balances. The board was 7 people, 5 of whom she had met and 2 of whom were new faces. The interim director, a cardiologist named Dr. Philip Warren, who had been on the board for 11 years and was clearly exhausted by the events of the previous 14 hours, ran the meeting with the energy of a man who had prepared for a board meeting about a routine budget matter and had arrived to find his hospital in an AG file. The meeting covered several things in sequence. Morrison's resignation was formally accepted. The events of the preceding night were reviewed against the documentation Holt's team had provided. Rutherford's presence in the hospital and his use of Morrison's administrative credentials were discussed at length. The camera access event was discussed. The licensing complaint was discussed. Then Dr. Warren set down his papers and looked at Emily directly. Miss Hartwell, he said, the board would like to formally address the events of last night. She waited. You were removed from this facility twice under circumstances that we now understand were orchestrated sources to serve an external unrelated to the clinical or administrative needs of this hospital. He said it carefully and he said it completely. The clinical decisions you made during the mass casualty event have been reviewed by 3 senior physicians, including Dr. Voss, and are being characterized as appropriate, skilled, and in at least 2 cases, decisive in ways that directly affected patient outcomes. The room was quiet. The board would like to formally withdraw every accusation made against you in connection with last night's events, and to formally apologize for the manner in which this institution failed to protect a member of its clinical staff from external pressure. He paused. That apology is mine personally as well. We should have done better. Emily sat with that for a moment. The formal language of institutional accountability was a strange thing. It sounded clean, and it wasn't, because the institution was made of people who had each made their own choices, and the apology covered them all in a way that distributed responsibility thin enough that it almost disappeared. She knew that. She'd spent enough time in enough institutional settings to understand exactly how much weight those words carried and exactly where they stopped. But Warren had said it clearly and had not hedged it, and that mattered, and she acknowledged it. Thank you, she said. We would like to offer you a formal position as Emergency Trauma Coordinator, Warren continued. A senior clinical role with administrative authority over the ER department's trauma protocols and staffing decisions. The position would report directly to the board, not through the medical director's office. He paused. We're creating the position, partly because we believe you're the right person for it, and partly because last night demonstrated that the hospital's existing structure had gaps that this role would address. The room was still quiet. Keisha was in the back row. Emily could feel her without looking. She thought about the position, about what it meant, not the title, not the reporting structure, but the practical reality of it. Authority to revise the protocols, authority to make clinical decisions without waiting for a physician's permission, authority to ensure that what had happened with Torelli and Okonkwo and Briggs could be navigated differently the next time someone arrived with needs that didn't fit the standard template. She also thought about what it cost, because there were things that came with visibility, with a formal title, with an official role that went in records and got queried by county IP addresses. She'd chosen small for a reason. But she had also come back to this building twice last night. She'd come back because people needed her, and she'd come back because some part of her had been done with small before she was ready to admit it. I'll consider it, she said. I'd like the terms in writing before I give you an answer. Warren nodded. Of course. She stood. I have a shift to finish. She left the conference room and went back to the floor, and she finished the shift the way she'd started it, moving through the department, checking charts, managing the particular rhythm of a Tuesday morning that was slower and quieter than the Tuesday night had been, the way mornings always were. At 4 p.m., when her replacement arrived, she gave the handoff she always gave, thorough, sequential, every patient status current, every flag documented, and she walked out through the main entrance. Reyes was in the parking lot. He was leaning against one of the remaining convoy vehicles, dressed and equipped, ready to travel. He looked up when she came through the doors. "Prakash left at noon," he said. "He said to tell you he'll call." "He won't," Emily said. Not bitterly, factually. Reyes considered that. "Probably not," he agreed. But he wanted to say it. She stopped near him. The afternoon light had the quality of a different day, entirely warmer than the pre-dawn cold. The mountains to the west lit along their western faces as the sun moved into its lower arc. The parking lot where Rutherford's car had sat dark and waiting was empty now. Nothing but asphalt and a faint oil stain. "How's the laceration?" she asked. "Tighter than I expected. It'll loosen." "Don't pick at it." "I wasn't going to pick at it." "You absolutely were going to pick at it." He made a face that was the closest thing to admission she was going to get. "Thank you," he said, "for last night. For all of it. You were part of it, too." "Yeah. But you were He stopped, looking for the word. The axis. The thing everything else rotated around. She considered that. It was a stranger compliment than she was accustomed to and more accurate than most. "Torelli's surgeon is good," she said. "She'll take care of him." "I know." He pushed off the vehicle. "For what it's worth, the whole unit knows what happened here. Not officially, it won't be in a report or anything. But the people who were in that building last night, they know." He paused. "People like you there aren't enough of them." She looked at him for a moment. He was 25, maybe 26, with a closed laceration above his orbital margin, and a concussion he was managing better than most, and the particular weight of someone who had been carrying things that didn't fit the categories available to him. "Take care of your head," she said. "The concussion protocols. All of them. 7 full days. 7 days," he said. "Got it." He got in the vehicle. She stood in the parking lot until it left, and then she stood a moment longer, and then she walked to her car. Over the following weeks, the structure of what had happened in Harlow Ridge was examined in the methodical way of investigators who had been given good material and sufficient authority to use it. The True Point alert logs were independently audited by a forensic technology firm contracted by the AG's office. Of Rutherford's 43 documented True Point-assisted arrests, 17 were found to have timestamp inconsistencies that could not be explained by system latency or calibration variance. In 11 of those cases, additional evidence suggested the alert had been manually entered after the stop occurred. Rutherford was formally charged on 4 counts: falsifying public records, obstruction of an official investigation, civil rights violations under state statute, and misconduct in office. The charge he was most afraid of, the one his lawyer worked hardest to negotiate around, was the civil rights count, because it carried the most exposure, and because it applied to individuals other than Emily. The 17 inconsistent arrests represented 17 people who had been stopped, in some cases detained, on the basis of an alert that had been manufactured. Walsh was charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and fraud in relation to a public contract. His cooperation, offered at 7:14 a.m., in exchange for consideration, produced the call records and the contents of his phone that formed the clearest picture of how the scheme had operated and who had known what and when. Hale was charged with conspiracy, with evidence tampering, and with filing a false complaint against a licensed professional, the last charge derived directly from the licensing board timestamp that Lena Marsh had documented, and Doyle had photographed on his phone at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in a hospital corridor. Hale's lawyer argued the complaint had been a good-faith procedural action. The timestamp argued otherwise, and did so without needing anyone to interpret it. The True Point contract was voided. The county initiated an independent review of all technology procurement contracts executed in the preceding 3 years. True Point Technologies settled a separate civil claim with the county, without admitting liability and without any public statement that gave anyone in Harlow Ridge the satisfaction of a direct acknowledgement, which was how those things almost always went, and Emily had expected no different. The 47 civilians affected by the compromised True Point arrests were formally notified by the county. An independent review board was established to evaluate each case. The notifications went out by certified mail, which was impersonal and insufficient and still better than what those 47 people had had the day before. Morrison was not charged with criminal offenses. The AG's office determined his involvement was primarily that of a man who had made accommodations he shouldn't have made and had signed off on things he hadn't examined closely enough. He'd accessed the security camera system, but the evidence of what he'd done with that access was ambiguous enough that prosecution was not pursued. He was named as a material witness. He was publicly identified in the Attorney General's report. He would carry that distinction into whatever the next phase of his career was. That was the shape of justice in practice, not complete, not entirely satisfying, full of edges where the evidence ran out, or the charges didn't stick, or the person in question had been careful enough to keep their fingerprints on the concept and off the specifics. Emily had seen enough of it to know this was how it always looked. The alternative was no accountability at all, and measured against that, the imperfect version was still something. She accepted the emergency trauma coordinator position 3 weeks after the board meeting. She accepted it in writing, in a document that specified her reporting structure, her clinical authority, her budget access for protocol revisions, and the independence of her role from any future medical director's office interference. Warren had negotiated on 2 points she'd held on both. The first thing she did in the new role was revise the hospital's mass casualty intake protocol to include a tiered credential recognition system, a framework that evaluated the actual skills and training of every person present, not just their current job title. The revision took 3 weeks to write, 6 weeks to pilot, and became operational 4 months after the night it had been made necessary. The second thing she did was establish a formal liaison relationship between Harlow Ridge's trauma department and the nearest military medical facility, creating a communication pathway for cases involving active duty and veteran personnel. It was not a dramatic arrangement, a shared protocol document, a standing contact list, a monthly call. But it meant that the next time a military convoy arrived with casualties and unusual injury profiles, the department would have context before they had patients. Kira the German Shepherd became a quarterly visitor to Harlow Ridge through a veteran outreach program Prakash facilitated from a distance and with the particular efficiency of someone who knew how to make things happen through channels that didn't require his name on anything. She came with Dawes and one other handler, and she sat very calmly in the pediatric waiting area and let children touch her ears, and she occasionally wandered through the ER corridor in the way of a working dog that had decided a place was hers to look after. The first time she came back, Emily was in the middle of a chart review. She heard the sound of Kira's nails on the linoleum before she saw her, and she looked up, and the dog came directly to her and put her large dark head against Emily's knee, and Emily sat there for a moment, with her hand on the dog's head, and her chart in her lap, and the department moving around her, and she let herself feel it, the whole long weight of it. The exhaustion and the justification and the years of small, and the night she'd stopped being small, and all the things that were still imperfect and unresolved and human about every part of it. She felt it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she finished the chart. There was a photograph on her desk now. Not the one from the closet shelf that once stayed where it was, because she wasn't ready for that conversation with herself yet. And she knew it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The desk photograph was new. It was from the board meeting, taken by Keisha on her phone, without announcing it Emily at the conference room table, in her scrubs because she'd come straight from the floor, her documentation file in front of her, looking at Warren with the expression she apparently made when she was deciding whether something was worth her time. She hadn't known Keisha had taken it until Keisha had sent it to her with no message, just the photo, and Emily had looked at it for a long time and then printed it on the break room printer and put it in a frame from the dollar section of the pharmacy 2 blocks from the hospital. She didn't look particularly heroic in it. She looked tired and certain and a little impatient, which was probably the most honest photograph of her that existed. The nursing badge on the lanyard around her neck was clearly visible. There was a version of this story in which Emily Hartwell had stayed small, in which she had walked out of the building the first time and driven home, and let Rutherford have his night and his narrative and his manufactured arrest record, in which the patients in bays 1 and 2 and 3 had been managed by the team available, some of them well and some of them not, and nobody would have known the difference, in which Thomas Briggs had been processed through a system that had been specifically calibrated to process people like Thomas Briggs without friction or examination. She had not stayed small, not because she was heroic. She was not particularly heroic. She was tired and stubborn, and she had learned a long time ago that the cost of staying silent was usually paid by someone other than the person who did the staying. That was the thing that people who hadn't been in positions like hers often got wrong about courage. They thought it was of not being afraid. It wasn't. She had been afraid in the specific way of a person who has built a quiet life and can feel it being threatened. She had been afraid, and she had come back through the side door with her expired access badge and her 4-year-old scrubs, because the alternative was a man in Bay 2 with a tension pneumothorax, and nobody in the room who knew what to do about the pleural scarring. She had done it for the patient first. That was the truest version. The rest, the timestamps and the documents and the long night in the corridor, had followed from the patient, the way consequences followed from choices, the way light followed from something that had been burning for a long time, in the dark. She was not the nurse everyone had dismissed. She was the nurse who had been standing in the room the whole time, and the dismissal had been its own kind of information, a map of who paid attention and who didn't, of which rooms would try to make you invisible, and which people in those rooms would let them. She'd walked out of that dismissal with her eyes open, and she'd walked back in, and in the space between those two ends, everything that needed to be known had been made clear. Her name was on a plaque outside the emergency trauma coordinator's office. She walked past it every morning at the start of her shift. She didn't stop to look at it most days. She had too much to do, but she knew it was there. And some mornings, the cold ones, the early April ones, when the light came off the mountains at that particular angle, she thought about the woman who had walked out of this building with a mechanical pencil left on the counter and a 4-year plan to be nobody, and she thought about what that woman had believed about what she deserved. She had been wrong about that. She knew it now. The badge on her lanyard still said E. Hartwell still said RN. It also said, below that in smaller text, Emergency Trauma Coordinator, and both things were true and both things were hers. And she had earned them in exactly the way that things worth having were earned, not smoothly, not without cost, not without being pushed to the wall and choosing, in that specific moment, not to stay there. She clipped it to her scrubs every morning. She went to work.